Before we continue on with this video, I'll just like to say that this video is for entertainment purposes. This is not a how-to upper back round video. Take everything what I say with a grain of salt. I'm not a professional chiropractor or a physiotherapist. I'm just the guy that likes to lift. So continue on, eat your popcorn. If you like this video, drop a like. So if you go to any social media comment section with someone rounding their back when deadlifting, you're always going to see that one comment from that guy saying, "Oh my god, you're going to be paraplegic by the age 40 and you're not going to be able to walk, and XYZ, you're going to hurt yourself, and rounding your back is the devil's sin." To some extent, I agree with the statement because more times than not, people don't know what they're doing when they're rounding their back. In this video, I'm not going to go into depth to why it's dangerous and why it's not dangerous. Just know that if you do a couple things right, you should be fine. These things are keeping your form consistent and making sure that that round from beginning to end does not get progressively more round throughout the lift. Before the bar leaves the floor, after the slack is pulled, my back position does not get more rounded throughout the lift, it just unravels at the top. Oftentimes you'll see more people that will round their upper back versus their lower back because it is a lot more difficult to unravel the lower back and more riskier than if you were to use the upper back for deadlifting. So now that we know a little bit more about back rounding and deadlifting, let's talk about some of the best elite deadlifters in the world for conventional deadlift. And in this list, we're going to be using Ashton Ruska, Jeremy Hamilton, and Konstantin Konstantinovs. And if you're wondering why I didn't use Eddie Hall or Thor for any of these people, it's because first off, Ruska is not 400 pounds. Each of these lifters were chosen for a particular reason, and that reason being is that each of these conventional pullers are very unique with their form. For example, with Ashton Ruska, he is a very flat puller and also pulls sumo, which will become more relevant later on in this video. With Jeremy Hamilton, he pulls with a bit of upper back rounding. And lastly, rest in peace, Konstantin, he pulls with an extreme amount of upper back rounding. Starting with flat back deadlifts, we have Ashton Ruska. Now, this guy has the perfect leverages for deadlifts, not only from body length proportions, but also from a muscular standpoint. And pretty much with Ashton Ruska, his weakest link is his strongest link, meaning not really one muscle group overpowers another. So I believe this is the most ideal situation for most lifters, that you have the ideal proportions, ideal leverages, and that you are pulling with a flat back, because a flat back is usually a more consistent lift as you're not depending on one muscle group more than the other, and you're pulling as a system as a whole rather than depending on one muscle group such as your erectors for a rounded back deadlift. Now let's move on to Jeremy Hamilton. Jeremy Hamilton is a slight back rounder for deadlifts, and this is probably where the vast majority of upper back rounders fall into, the slight round. And the reason why I think most people have a slight round is to exchange speed off the ground for speed at the top. So rounding your back allows you to start with a bit of higher hips, and so you'll have an easier time getting the weight off the ground with more leg drive, and you'll trade off that speed at the bottom for speed at the top. Often lifters with shorter arms prefer to round with the upper back, and that's for the same reason being that they want to start with higher hips to exchange more speed off the floor for the top. So I could have chosen a vast amount of people for this particular subgroup of upper back rounders, but the reason I chose Jeremy Hamilton was one, because I like him, he's low key, and he doesn't do this for anything but the passion of lifting. And second, he has a great video made with Omar Isuf talking about how he upper back rounds. Lastly, the difference between a flat back and rounded back in this scenario is not very different. And one indicator to me that this is not very different for the lifter is that their stance is still the same. And this does make a difference. I'll get to it with Konstantin, but using an upper back rounded position allows some lifters to lift more, ultimately raising the ceiling for what they would do otherwise with a flat back. And they're not necessarily imbalanced with their weakest, strongest link, but there is probably some difference between upper back strength and other supporting muscles compared to that of a flat back puller. Let's get to super rounded with Konstantin Konstantinovs. So as I mentioned earlier, I told you to pay attention to Jeremy Hamilton's stance. Now pay attention to Konstantin Konstantinov's stance. He is very narrow, and the reason being is that you start with even higher hips when you have a more narrow stance, and you could round your back a lot better, and ultimately you could drive as hard as possible with a narrower stance. The main drivers of your deadlift is going to be your quads off the floor, your glutes for lockout, and your upper back throughout the whole movement. If you have all these boxes checked and they're really strong, then that's a recipe for a really strong deadlift, despite having weak hamstrings and other muscle groups. From a hypertrophy perspective, this deadlift technique is not very balanced because you're not really training or using all your muscle groups as you would with a traditional flat back deadlifting technique. That does not say that this technique does not require work and tons of time to actually dial in on efficiency. All it means is that you're going to have a greater differentiation from your strongest link versus your weakest link. Before I stopped conventional deadlifts, I was exactly at this stage where I was super rounded. I had strong glutes, decent quad strength off the ground, and strong upper back. The issue with this style of pulling is that my ceiling is relatively limited to these muscle groups. If I want to get stronger, I had to change something. It was obvious that when I pulled flat with conventional, I was way less stronger. Instead of just training flat back, I decided I'd rather raise my overall ceiling by starting to train sumo. So now you're probably sitting there thinking, Justin, if you just train flat back, you can just raise your overall potential with your conventional deadlift. Yes, that's true, but the nature of a conventional deadlift is already predominantly upper back strength, glutes, and not as much inner thigh muscles as with sumo deadlifts. And so transitioning to sumo, aside from all the range of motion that's cut, I am working a muscle group that hasn't been worked the same as with conventional deadlifts, and that's pretty much the inner thigh muscles. So in combination of working these muscles, potentially cutting range of motion, and introducing my rounded back position, that to me sounded like a recipe for success, and that's pretty much why I transitioned from conventional to sumo deadlifts. So Ashton Ruska is a very flat conventional puller and a very flat sumo puller. He's a traditional sumo puller where he'll take his time off the bottom of the floor. So how does one adapt from a rounded conventional deadlift to a rounded sumo deadlift like myself? Because I'm obviously not a traditional flat back conventional deadlifter. Unlike Ashton Ruska, because I don't have the flat fundamentals that he does, I wasn't so ready to let everything go in terms of my current numbers just to adapt to traditional sumo deadlifts. Instead, I've taken the best of both worlds, the advantageous reduced roam from sumo deadlifts and the reduced effort off the ground speed by rounding my back. Since I'm standing a lot wider, I am naturally more upright. I don't need to round my back nearly as much while keeping a high hip height. So I just hyped up rounded back sumo deadlifts, but yet I barely can give an example, right? While on the other hand, if we're to talk about conventional deadlifts, we have Jeremy Hamilton, Constantine, XYZ. We have a bunch of people in powerlift pulling with a rounded back and openly coming out and talking about rounded back deadlifts. But what about sumo? Are there any people that are at elite numbers pulling with a rounded back? You think it's just me? Well, you're pretty wrong. Because there's this guy, he's kind of low key, I don't know if you know him. He goes by the name Jamal. I'm pretty sure he has the world's strongest sumo deadlift. He 100% pulls with a rounded back. Reasons to why you might not think he pulls with a rounded back is that it's often masked with the bar whip that he uses, which is a specialty bar called a deadlift bar. And so with a deadlift bar, you can get into a little bit more upright of a position. If you use that positioning plus a rounded back position, that's a really good recipe. And that's clearly what Jamal is showing out in elite level powerlifting. And if you have doubts, just know that when you're pulling with a rounded back, a pretty obvious indicator that you're pulling with a rounded back is that your speed off the ground is going to be a lot quicker and your lockout is going to be a lot more difficult than what it should be in comparison to speed off the ground. So that's just a little analysis video. I hope you enjoyed this video. That's about it. Peace out.